The emergency beacon cut through the silence of space like a scream in the dark. Commander Elena Vasquez had been running routine patrol sweeps along the Kepler system's outer rim when the distress signal reached her ship's sensors. Protocol dictated that all emergency beacons receive immediate response, regardless of origin or circumstance. What protocol didn't account for was finding a signal that had been broadcasting for 3 standard months with no one bothering to answer. Elena's fingers danced across the holographic interface of her ship's navigation system, plotting a course toward the source. The Determination, her mid-class patrol vessel, wasn't built for comfort, but it was reliable. She'd been alone for 6 days now, which was longer than most humans preferred, but Elena had always found solitude easier to handle than the endless chatter of crew members. Space was quiet, predictable. People were not. The source of the beacon lay on Kepler 442c, a barren moon orbiting a gas giant that most spacers avoided. The moon had no atmosphere worth breathing, no resources worth mining, and no strategic value worth claiming. It was the kind of place where things went to be forgotten or abandoned. As her ship descended through the thin atmospheric layer, Elena caught her first glimpse of what awaited her below. The scanner readings made no sense. The beacon was definitely alien in origin, specifically Zalithian based on the frequency patterns, but there were no Zalithian settlements in this system. No official records of their presence anywhere within a dozen light-years. The surface of the moon stretched out beneath her like a canvas painted in shades of rust and shadow. Massive rock formations jutted up from the barren landscape like the bones of some ancient giant. Between them, valleys filled with loose gravel and the occasional patch of hardy vegetation that somehow managed to survive in a thin atmosphere. Elena brought her ship down in a natural clearing about half a kilometer from the beacon's source. The landing thrusters kicked up clouds of reddish dust that took several minutes to settle. She ran through her pre-departure checklist with practiced efficiency. Environmental suits sealed and pressurized, life support systems active, emergency beacon activated, weapon charged and holstered. The routine was comforting, familiar. It gave structure to the unknown. The surface of the moon was even more desolate than the scans had indicated. Gravity was roughly 60% of Earth's standard, making each step feel slightly bouncy. The horizon seemed closer than it should have been, creating an odd sense of claustrophobia despite the open landscape. Above, the gas giant dominated the sky like a massive eye watching her every move. Elena followed her scanner's guidance across the rocky terrain, climbing over boulders and navigating around deep crevices that dropped away into darkness. The beacon grew stronger with each step until finally she crested a low ridge and found its source. The creature lay in a natural depression between 2 rock formations, as if it had sought shelter and simply never gotten back up. Elena's first thought was that she was looking at a small spacecraft that had crashed and been partially buried by debris. The thing was massive, easily 15 meters long and 4 meters high at what might have been its shoulders. Its surface was covered in what looked like dark metallic plating, but as she moved closer, she realized her mistake. The plating was fur. Thick, dense fur that had once been a deep midnight black, but was now matted and dull. Beneath it, she could make out the powerful muscle structure of a quadruped built for both speed and strength. The creature's head was turned away from her, but she could see enough to know that this was no ordinary animal. The proportions were wrong for anything that had evolved naturally. Too large, too perfectly balanced between different evolutionary advantages, but what made Elena's breath catch in her throat were the parasites. They covered the creature's body like a living carpet, each one roughly the size of her fist. They moved constantly, undulating across the fur in waves that made her stomach turn. Where they had been feeding, she could see patches of raw, infected flesh. The smell hit her even through her environmental suit's filters, a mixture of decay and something sickeningly sweet that made her want to gag. The creature was still alive. She could see the shallow rise and fall of its massive chest, could hear through her suit's external microphones the labored sound of its breathing. It was dying slowly, eaten alive by the parasites that covered nearly every inch of its body. Elena activated her scanner and ran a detailed biological analysis. The results confirmed what she had suspected. The creature was definitely Zalithian in origin, though heavily modified. The parasites were also Zalithian, but they weren't native to the creature's biology. Someone had infected it deliberately. The beacon was embedded in what looked like a collar around the creature's neck. Not a restraint, but a monitoring device. Elena's scanner identified multiple transmission arrays, biological sensors, and what appeared to be a data storage unit. The collar had been broadcasting not just a distress signal, but detailed biological data about the creature's condition and the progression of the parasitic infection. Someone had been using this creature as a test subject. Elena circled around to get a better look at the creature's head, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the parasites. What she saw there made her understanding of the situation shift completely. The creature's face, while definitely feline in basic structure, showed clear signs of intelligence modification. The cranium was enlarged to accommodate a larger brain. The eyes, though currently closed, were positioned for better depth perception and were noticeably larger than they should have been for a creature of this size. Most telling of all, there were neural interface ports behind each ear, still connected to thin cables that led back to the collar. This wasn't just an animal. It was a person. Elena knelt down beside the massive head, studying the neural interfaces more closely. The technology was definitely Zilithian, but it was crude, obviously experimental. The ports were surrounded by scar tissue and showed signs of repeated use. Someone had been plugging into this creature's mind, probably for months or even years. The breathing changed, becoming more rapid and shallow. Elena looked up to see that one of the creature's eyes had opened. It was a brilliant amber color, shot through with flecks of gold. For a moment, human and whatever this creature was stared at each other in silence. Intelligence looked back at her. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but genuine sapience. The eye held pain, yes, but also recognition. It knew she was there. It knew she was different from whoever had done this to it. Elena made a decision that would have horrified her superiors back at Central Command. She activated her emergency medical kit and began pulling out supplies. The smart thing would have been to document the scene, contact headquarters, and wait for a full investigation team. The safe thing would have been to put the creature out of its misery and file a report about possible illegal biological experiments. Instead, she started treating the parasites. The medical kit contained broad-spectrum antiparasitic compounds that worked on most known biological systems. Elena had no idea if they would be effective against these particular organisms, or if they might harm the creature in the process. But doing nothing was clearly not an option. She started with a small area on the creature's flank, carefully removing parasites with surgical tools and applying antiparasitic gel to the affected tissue. The parasites resisted, their grip on the creature's flesh stronger than she had expected. Several of them turned toward her as she worked, apparently sensing the threat she represented. The creature remained still throughout the process, though Elena could see its muscles tense with pain as she worked. The amber eye tracked her movements, watching everything she did, with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. After an hour of work, Elena had cleared roughly 2 square meters of the creature's flank. The results were encouraging. Where she had removed the parasites and applied treatment, the raw flesh was already beginning to show signs of healing. Whatever genetic modifications had been done to the creature included enhanced regenerative capabilities. Elena sat back on her heels and wiped sweat from her forehead. Even with her suit's temperature regulation, the work was exhausting. The creature was huge, and she had barely made a dent in treating the infestation. At this rate, it would take her days to clear all the parasites, assuming she could even manage it with her limited medical supplies. The creature made a sound then, something between a rumble and a whine. It was trying to communicate something, though Elena had no way to understand what. She moved closer to the massive head and knelt down beside it. "I'm trying to help," she said, though she doubted the creature could understand her words. "I know it hurts, but I'm trying to help you." The amber eye blinked slowly, and Elena could have sworn she saw something like gratitude in its depths. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost questioning. Elena pulled up her scanner's linguistic analysis program and had it record the vocalizations. If there was a pattern, if this was actually language rather than just animal sounds, the program might be able to identify it. The results came back faster than she had expected. The vocalization showed clear signs of linguistic structure, subject-verb-object relationships, tonal variations that indicated meaning rather than just emotion, even what appeared to be grammatical markers. This creature wasn't just intelligent, it was actively trying to talk to her. Elena looked back at the vast expanse of the creature's body, covered in parasites and clearly dying slowly. She looked at her limited medical supplies and her single-person ship with its minimal cargo space. She thought about the regulations that required her to report any signs of illegal biological experimentation, the protocols that demanded she wait for proper authorities before taking action. Then she looked back at that amber eye, watching her with such trust and hope that it made her chest ache. "Okay," she said aloud, more to herself than to the creature. "Let me think about this." Elena stood up and walked a short distance away, far enough that she could see the entire situation clearly. The creature was dying. The parasites were killing it slowly, probably as part of whatever sick experiment had been conducted here. The beacon had been broadcasting for 3 months with no response, which meant whoever was responsible had written off their test subject and moved on. But the creature was still alive, still intelligent, still capable of hope. Elena activated her ship's communication system and composed a message to her commanding officer. She reported finding a crashed alien vessel and requested permission to extend her patrol to conduct a thorough investigation. She made no mention of the creature, the parasites, or the biological experimentation. Not yet. She had bought herself time, but not much. Central Command would expect a full report within 72 hours. If she was going to do something, she needed to do it fast. Elena returned to the creature and knelt down beside its head again. The amber eye was still watching her, still hopeful despite everything that had been done to it. "I'm going to get you out of here," she said, knowing the creature couldn't understand her words, but hoping it might understand her tone. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to get you out of here." The creature made that soft questioning sound again, and this time Elena's scanner identified definite linguistic patterns. With more data points, the analysis program might be able to construct a basic translation matrix. Elena spent the next several hours working on the creature's injuries while her scanner recorded every vocalization. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The sounds weren't random. They were words. Simple concepts at first. Pain, help, fear, gratitude. But as the program gathered more data, more complex ideas became apparent. The creature had a name for itself, something that the scanner's best approximation rendered as Kethvar. It understood that Elena was trying to help, and it was grateful beyond measure. But more than that, it was afraid, not of Elena, but of others who would come looking. Others who would be very angry that their experiment had been interfered with. Elena paused in her work as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about saving one creature from a horrible death. By helping Kethvar, she had potentially put herself in conflict with whoever was responsible for the biological experiments. If they discovered what she was doing, they might consider her a threat to be eliminated. She looked down at Kethvar's massive form, at the intelligent amber eye watching her with such trust. The smart thing would be to stop now, to walk away and report this through proper channels. Let someone else deal with the political implications and potential dangers. Elena had never been very good at doing the smart thing. She activated her ship's medical bay and began planning how to get a 15-meter-long creature aboard a vessel designed for a crew of 5. It was going to require some creative engineering, but she had 72 hours to figure it out. One way or another, she was taking Kethvar home. Elena spent the next 6 hours converting her ship's cargo bay into a makeshift medical facility. The Determination wasn't built to carry passengers of Kethvar's size, but necessity had always been the mother of invention. She stripped out the non-essential storage units, rerouted life support systems, and rigged up an improvised quarantine field using emergency containment protocols designed for hazardous materials. The hardest part wasn't the engineering. It was the ethical calculation that kept running through her mind as she worked. Every regulation she had sworn to uphold told her this was wrong. Elena was tampering with evidence of what appeared to be illegal biological experimentation. She was removing a potentially dangerous alien creature from a crime scene. She was operating far beyond her authority as a patrol commander. But every time she started to reconsider, she thought of that amber eye watching her with desperate hope. Regulations were created by people who had never stood on a barren moon watching something die slowly, while its own kind abandoned it to suffer alone. The communication system chimed, indicating an incoming message from Central Command. Elena's stomach clenched as she opened the transmission, but it was just a routine status update request. She filed a standard patrol report indicating she was investigating potential salvage on Kepler 442C and would provide full details upon mission completion. Buying time was becoming a habit. Elena returned to Kethvar with a portable medical unit and began the painstaking process of clearing more parasites. Each one had to be carefully removed to avoid leaving parts behind that could cause infection. The antiparasitic compounds were working, but slowly. Where she had treated the creature earlier, new tissue growth was visible, but the sheer scope of the infestation made the task feel overwhelming. As she worked, Elena continued recording Kethvar's vocalizations. The translation program was making steady progress, building a basic vocabulary that allowed for simple communication. Kethvar seemed to understand that Elena was helping, but the creature was also trying to warn her about something. "Others come," the scanner translated from Kethvar's low rumbling sounds. "Others angry, dangerous." Elena paused in her work. "Who are the others? The ones who did this to you?" Kethvar's response came in a mixture of sounds that the scanner struggled to interpret. The translation came back fragmented. Makers, pain givers, shadow ship, return soon. The implication was clear. Whoever was responsible for the biological experiments would be coming back to check on their test subject. Elena had no idea when. but Kefvar seemed to think it would be soon. How soon? Elena asked, directing the question toward the creature's head where she assumed the ears were located beneath the matted fur. The response was a series of rhythmic sounds that took the scanner several minutes to analyze. When the translation appeared, Elena's blood ran cold. Sun rising? Next sun rising? They come. Elena looked up at the sky where Kepler 442c's primary star hung low on the horizon. A day. Maybe less. She had assumed she would have the full 72 hours before anyone came looking, but Kefvar's captors operated on their own schedule. The smart thing would be to leave now, to get her ship away from here before whoever was coming arrived. She could file her report from a safe distance and let Central Command deal with the situation through proper diplomatic channels. Instead, Elena doubled her efforts. She activated every medical drone her ship carried and programmed them to begin systematic parasite removal from Kefvar's extremities while she continued working on the creature's torso. The process was still painfully slow, but at least now she had help. As the hours passed, Elena began to understand the scope of what had been done to Kefvar. This wasn't just biological experimentation. It was torture dressed up as science. The parasites had been specifically engineered to cause maximum suffering while keeping their host alive. They secreted toxins that caused constant pain but not death. They reproduced slowly enough to avoid overwhelming the host's immune system, but fast enough to ensure the infestation would be permanent without treatment. Kefvar had been suffering like this for months, possibly years. The neural interfaces showed signs of repeated use, suggesting that the creature's captors had been monitoring not just its physical condition but its mental state as well. They had been studying how a sentient being responded to prolonged torture. Elena's hands shook with anger as she worked. She had seen cruelty before in her years as a patrol officer, but this was different. This was systematic, calculated cruelty conducted with scientific precision, the kind of evil that hid behind research protocols and academic papers. Why? She asked Kefvar during a brief rest break. Why did they do this to you? The creature's response came slowly, as if remembering was painful. The scanner's translation was fragmentary but clear enough. Study, pain, fear, breaking, mind songs. Silence them. Mind songs. Elena wasn't sure what that meant, but the context suggested it was something important to Kefvar's species, something the experimenters had been trying to destroy. As the day progressed, Elena managed to clear roughly a quarter of the parasites from Kefvar's body. The creature's condition was improving noticeably. Where the parasites had been removed, healthy fur was beginning to regrow. More importantly, Kefvar seemed more alert, more responsive. The amber eyes tracked Elena's movements with increasing clarity, but time was running out. Elena's scanner detected atmospheric disturbance in the upper atmosphere as something entered the moon's airspace. It was too far away for detailed analysis, but the signature suggested a medium-sized vessel running silent, probably Zilithian based on the engine configuration. They come, Kefvar rumbled, the translation clear despite the creature's obvious fear. Leave now. Save yourself. Elena looked at the massive creature, still covered in parasites despite hours of work. Kefvar was in no condition to be moved. The shock of transport might kill the creature anyway, but staying meant confronting whoever was responsible for this atrocity, and Elena had no idea what she was up against. She made her decision. Elena activated her ship's emergency protocols and began preparing for immediate departure. But instead of abandoning Kefvar, she rigged up a portable life support system and began the dangerous process of moving the creature. "What are you doing?" Kefvar asked, the translation program now working smoothly enough to convey the creature's confusion. "Getting you out of here," Elena replied, knowing Kefvar couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone would convey her intent. Moving a 15-meter-long creature while parasites were still attached was incredibly dangerous, but Elena had no choice. She used her ship's cargo manipulator arms to carefully lift Kefvar while medical drones continued their work. The creature remained still despite what must have been enormous pain. The incoming ship was closer now. Elena's sensors indicated it was definitely Zilithian, but it wasn't broadcasting any identification codes. That was either very bad news or very good news, depending on how one looked at it. Official Zilithian vessels would have demanded explanations and diplomatic protocols. An unofficial ship might be more direct in its approach. Elena managed to get Kefvar into her cargo bay just as the other ship entered visual range. Through her viewport, she could see it was a sleek, predatory-looking vessel painted in the dark grays and blacks favored by Zilithian special operations units. Definitely not scientists coming to check on their research. The ship settled down near the depression where Kefvar had been lying. Elena watched through her external cameras as several figures in environmental suits emerged and moved quickly toward the empty crater. Even at this distance, she could see their agitation when they discovered their test subject was missing. One of them was carrying a device that Elena recognized as a biological tracker. They would be able to follow Kethvar's trail right to her ship. Elena powered up her engines and lifted off without waiting for clearance or challenge. The other ship reacted immediately, its weapon systems coming online as it rose to intercept her. Warning shots flashed past her viewports, followed by a communication burst in Zalithian. Elena didn't speak Zalithian, but her ship's translator provided a rough approximation. Halt immediately. Return stolen property. Compliance required. Stolen property. They were talking about Kethvar as if the creature was equipment to be recovered rather than a person who had been tortured. Elena ignored the warning and pushed her engines to maximum burn. The determination wasn't built for speed, but she had a head start and intimate knowledge of the local asteroid field. If she could reach the cover of the asteroids, she might be able to lose her pursuers. The Zalithian ship was faster but less maneuverable. Elena threw her vessel into a series of evasive patterns that would have been impossible with a normal crew complement. Only the fact that she was alone allowed her to pull accelerations that would have crushed passengers. Behind her, Kethvar was secured in the cargo bay's medical containment field. The creature had remained conscious throughout the launch, those amber eyes watching Elena work with an expression that might have been awe. Elena reached the asteroid field with the Zalithian ship gaining steadily behind her. Weapons fire bracketed her vessel as she ducked between the massive rocks, using the asteroids for cover. Her ship's hull rang with impact from near misses, but the determination was built to survive rough treatment. The chase continued for over an hour, Elena weaving through the asteroid field while her pursuers tried to corner her. Finally, she managed to break free of the field and jump to hyperspace just as the Zalithian ship closed to weapons range. As the stars elongated into lines in space folded around her ship, Elena allowed herself to breathe for the first time in hours. They were safe, for now. But she had just kidnapped what the Zalithians considered their property, and that would have consequences. Elena set course for the nearest human space station and then went to check on her passenger. She found Kethvar still conscious, the massive head turned toward her as she entered the cargo bay. The medical drones had continued their work during the escape, clearing more parasites and treating the infected areas. "Thank you," Kethvar said, the words clear through the translation system. "Freedom, hope, life, thank you." Elena knelt down beside the creature's head and gently touched the fur between its ears. It was soft, softer than she had expected, and she could feel the warmth of life beneath. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. "Where can you go? Do you have family? Friends?" Kethvar's response was long and complex, taking several minutes for the scanner to translate. When the words appeared on Elena's display, she felt her heart break a little. Kethvar had been taken as a juvenile, modified, and experimented on for most of their life. They had no memory of family or homeworld. The neural modifications had been designed to suppress certain aspects of Zalithian psychology, particularly what Kethvar called the mind songs, apparently some form of telepathic communication common to their species. Elena was harboring an alien who had been systematically isolated from their own kind and tortured for scientific purposes. Kethvar was as alone in the universe as it was possible to be. "Well," Elena said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "I guess that makes two of us." She had no idea what she was going to tell Central Command. She had no idea how she was going to explain harboring an escaped alien test subject. She had definitely no idea what she was going to do if the Zalithians demanded Kethvar's return through diplomatic channels. But for the first time since finding that amber eye watching her with desperate hope, Elena felt like she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, at least Kethvar would face it free from the parasites that had been eating them alive. Elena activated her ship's medical bay and began preparing for major surgery. The parasites might be gone, but the damage they had caused would require extensive treatment. It was going to be a long journey home, and she had work to do. Behind her, Kethvar began to make a new sound, something the scanner identified as singing. It was hauntingly beautiful, full of harmonies that seemed impossible for a single voice to produce. Elena realized she was hearing the mind songs that Kethvar's captors had tried so hard to silence. The sound filled the cargo bay with something Elena hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Whatever happened when they reached human space, it would be worth it to hear that song. The journey to Haven Station took 12 days, and Elena spent every waking hour working to repair the damage that months of torture had inflicted on Kethvar's body and mind. The medical drones had removed the last of the parasites within 48 hours of departure, but the real work was just beginning. Kethvar's body bore scars from the neural interfaces, chemical burns from parasite secretions, and muscle atrophy from prolonged immobility. But the psychological damage was harder to assess and even harder to treat. Elena found herself becoming an amateur xenopsychologist, learning about Zalithian mental architecture through careful observation and conversation. The mind songs were the key to understanding. As Kethvar grew stronger, they began to explain what Elena was witnessing. Zalithians were naturally telepathic, but not in the way humans typically imagine telepathy. They didn't read thoughts directly, but rather shared emotional and conceptual harmonies that created a form of collective consciousness. "We sing the world together," Kethvar explained during one of their longer conversations. The translation software had become remarkably sophisticated, able to convey not just words, but emotional undertones. "Each mind adds to the great song that defines reality for all Zalithians." The neural modifications had been designed to cut Kethvar off from this collective consciousness. The experimenters hadn't just been studying pain and suffering. They had been researching how to create perfect isolation in a species that defined existence through connection. Elena found herself growing angrier with each revelation. The more she understood what had been done to Kethvar, the more she realized she was harboring not just a victim of torture, but potentially the victim of genocide. If the techniques developed through Kethvar's suffering could be applied to other Zalithians, an entire species could be mentally crippled. But there was hope as well. As Kethvar's physical health improved, their ability to produce the mind songs grew stronger. Elena often found herself listening to the harmonies that filled the cargo bay, beautiful and complex compositions that seemed to shift based on Kethvar's emotional state. When the creature was content, the songs were peaceful and flowing. When they were remembering their captivity, the music became harsh and discordant. Elena had been dreading her arrival at Haven Station, but as her ship approached the massive orbital facility, she realized she had no choice but to trust in humanity's better angels. The station's traffic control hailed her with routine identification requests, and Elena responded with standard protocols while her mind raced through possible explanations for her unusual passenger. Haven Station was a bustling hub of interspecies commerce and diplomacy, one of humanity's most successful attempts at creating a neutral space where different species could interact safely. If anywhere in human space could handle the political complications of harboring an escaped alien test subject, it would be here. Elena requested docking at one of the medical bays, claiming a biological emergency that required specialized treatment facilities. It wasn't technically a lie, though the full truth was considerably more complex. As her ship settled into the docking bay, Elena made a decision that surprised her. Instead of trying to hide Kethvar's presence or sneak the creature past station security, she contacted the station's medical chief directly and requested an emergency consultation for a rescued alien victim of biological experimentation. Sarah Chen, the station's chief medical officer, arrived at Elena's ship within an hour. Elena had met Chen before during previous visits to Haven Station, and she knew the doctor's reputation for discretion and competence. If anyone could help Kethvar, it would be someone with Chen's experience in xenobiology. Chen's reaction to seeing Kethvar was everything Elena had hoped for. After an initial moment of shock at the creature's size, the doctor immediately focused on the medical evidence of torture and experimentation. Her examination was thorough and professional, but Elena could see the anger building in Chen's expression as she cataloged the damage. "Who did this?" Chen asked quietly, her scanners revealing the extent of the neural modifications and parasite damage. Elena explained everything: the distress beacon, the abandoned creature, the parasites, the pursuing ship. Chen listened without comment, occasionally asking technical questions about Kethvar's condition or the treatment Elena had provided. When Elena finished her account, Chen was silent for several minutes, studying the data her scanners had collected. Finally, she looked up at Elena with an expression of grim determination. "This is going to cause a diplomatic incident," Chen said, "but it's also going to expose what appears to be systematic torture being conducted under the guise of scientific research. The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences." Elena looked at Kethvar, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest despite not understanding the words. The amber eyes met hers with the same trust and hope she had seen on that barren moon. "I'm prepared," Elena said. What followed was a carefully orchestrated revelation that would reshape humanity's relationship with the galactic community. Chen brought in her most trusted colleagues, each sworn to secrecy until they could present a complete medical assessment of Kethvar's condition. The evidence they assembled was damning. The neural modification showed clear signs of multiple surgical procedures, each designed to isolate specific aspects of Zalithian consciousness. The chemical residue from the parasites indicated they were artificially engineered rather than naturally occurring. Most disturbing of all, the monitoring equipment embedded in Kethvar's collar contained detailed records of the torture sessions, complete with psychological profiles and optimization recommendations. Elena found herself at the center of an expanding circle of horrified medical professionals, each adding their expertise to the growing body of evidence. Xenopsychologists documented the mental isolation techniques. Bioethicists cataloged the violations of established research protocols. Diplomats began crafting responses that would protect both Kethvar and the broader implications of the discovery. But the most important voice in all of this belonged to Kethvar themselves. As word of the situation spread through Haven Station's leadership, Kethvar was asked to provide testimony about their experiences. Elena served as translator and advocate, helping the creature navigate questions from beings who had no frame of reference for what they had endured. Kethvar's account was devastating in its clarity. They described years of systematic torture disguised as research conducted by a group that claimed to be studying alternative approaches to interspecies psychology. The experiments had been designed to find ways to suppress telepathic abilities in other species, potentially for military applications. They wanted to understand how to make others like me, Kethvar explained through Elena's translation. Silent, alone, cut off from the songs that make us whole. The implications were staggering. If this research was being applied to other species, it could represent a new form of warfare, psychological weapons designed to destroy the fundamental nature of telepathic civilizations. Elena found herself thrust into a role she had never wanted, the key witness in what was becoming the most significant interspecies rights case in human history. Diplomats from a dozen different species arrived at Haven Station as news of the situation spread. The Zalithian government initially demanded Kethvar's immediate return, claiming the creature was a criminal who had stolen classified research materials. But Kethvar's testimony, backed by the medical evidence and the data recovered from their collar, told a different story. Elena watched as representatives from species across the galaxy listened to accounts of systematic torture and isolation. The universal horror that greeted these revelations gave her hope that justice might actually be possible. The breakthrough came when Kethvar began to sing. During one particularly difficult session with Zalithian officials who insisted that Kethvar was lying about their treatment, the creature began to produce the mind songs Elena had heard during their journey. But these weren't the peaceful harmonies she remembered. These were songs of pain, isolation, and desperate hope, a musical record of everything Kethvar had endured. The effect on the Zalithian officials was immediate and dramatic. Several of them began to weep openly, their own telepathic abilities resonating with the emotional content of Kethvar's songs. Within minutes, the entire official delegation was demanding to know who was responsible for such cruelty to one of their own kind. Elena realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a truth that couldn't be denied, filtered through the very abilities that the experiments had tried to destroy. Kethvar's mind songs were proof that their telepathic connections had survived the torture, and the songs themselves carried the emotional reality of their experience in a way that no verbal testimony could match. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed. The data from Kethvar's collar provided clear evidence of the illegal research program, including the identities of those involved and the location of their primary facility. Elena found herself providing testimony to diplomatic tribunals, medical ethics boards, and military intelligence services. But the most satisfying moment came when Elena was called to testify before the Galactic Council's Ethics Committee. The same officials who might have demanded she follow proper protocols and turned Kethvar over to authorities were now commending her actions as heroic intervention in systematic torture. Commander Vasquez, the council chair said, your decision to prioritize immediate medical aid over diplomatic protocol appears to have prevented not only further suffering for the victim but potentially the expansion of this illegal research program to other species. The council wishes to commend your actions and ask what support you and the victim require going forward. Elena looked back at the viewing area where Kethvar was watching the proceedings through a translated feed. The creature had grown stronger over the past weeks, their mind songs becoming more complex and beautiful as their isolation-induced damage began to heal. Kethvar needs time, Elena said. Time to heal, time to reconnect with their own people, time to remember what it means to be part of the greater song again. And they need justice for what was done to them. Justice came in multiple forms. The illegal research program was shut down and its perpetrators arrested. Reparations were paid to compensate for Kethvar's suffering. Most importantly, new protocols were established for monitoring biological research to prevent similar atrocities in the future. Elena was offered a promotion, a transfer to diplomatic service, and recognition as a hero of interspecies relations. She declined all of them. She had one request that trumped any official honors: the right to continue serving as Kethvar's advocate and friend as they rebuilt their life. "You saved me," Kethvar told her as they prepared to leave Haven Station for a Zilithian rehabilitation facility where experts in telepathic trauma could help complete their healing. "We saved each other," Elena replied, and she meant it. The experience had changed her understanding of what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of other intelligent species. Compassion, she had learned, was not a luxury that could be set aside when regulations demanded it. Sometimes doing the right thing required breaking every rule that got in the way. As their ship departed Haven Station, Elena listened to Kethvar singing in the cargo bay that had been converted into comfortable quarters. The mine songs were different now, still beautiful, but carrying undertones of hope and belonging that hadn't been there before. Elena smiled, knowing that somewhere in those harmonies the galaxy itself was being sung into a slightly better shape than it had been before, and she had played a small part in making that possible. The Zilithian rehabilitation facility on Kythara Prime was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. Built into the living rock of a mountain that hummed with natural harmonic resonances, the facility seemed to grow from the landscape itself rather than being imposed upon it. Crystalline spires rose from terraced gardens where plants from a dozen worlds created symphonies of color and texture that somehow complemented the constant, subtle vibrations that filled the air. Elena had expected to drop Kethvar off and return to her duties, but the facility's director, an elderly Zilithian named Sirith Moore, had requested that she remain as part of the treatment team. Elena's presence, they explained, had become essential to Kethvar's psychological stability. The human represented safety and hope in ways that even other Zilithians could not match. "Your species has a word," Sirith Moore said during Elena's first meeting with the treatment team. "I'm printing." Young beings form deep psychological bonds with those who protect them during times of extreme vulnerability. Kethvar has imprinted on you in a way that transcends normal species boundaries. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had saved Kethvar's life, but now she was committed to helping rebuild it. The process, Sirith Moore warned, would be complex and potentially dangerous. Reestablishing telepathic connections after systematic isolation required careful guidance to prevent psychological damage. The facility housed 37 other Zilithians who had suffered various forms of mental trauma. Some were veterans of the recent border conflicts who had experienced telepathic warfare. Others were survivors of industrial accidents that had damaged their neural architecture. A few, like Kethvar, were victims of deliberate torture. Elena was given quarters adjacent to Kethvar's treatment suite and assigned a Zilithian liaison named Veth Kir, who would help her understand the complex process of telepathic rehabilitation. Veth Kir was young by Zilithian standards, barely past adolescence, but their specialty in cross-species psychology made them uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between human and Zilithian perspectives. "The mind songs are not just communication," Veth Kir explained during Elena's orientation. "They are existence itself. To be cut off from the songs is to cease being truly alive." Kethvar has survived something that should have been impossible. Elena watched through specialized observation equipment as Kethvar underwent their first formal therapy session. The creature lay in the center of a circular chamber whose walls were lined with resonance crystals that could amplify and modulate telepathic transmissions. Around the chamber, 3 experienced therapists worked to create safe harmonic spaces where Kethvar could begin to reconnect with the collective consciousness of their species. The process was painfully slow. Years of isolation had left Kethvar's telepathic abilities atrophied and hypersensitive. Even the gentlest mental contact caused obvious distress, the creature's massive form tensing with remembered trauma. The therapist worked with infinite patience, creating progressively more complex harmonic patterns that Kethvar could safely engage with. Elena found herself learning Zilithian concepts for which no human equivalent existed. The mind songs operated on multiple levels simultaneously: emotional resonance, conceptual sharing, memory integration, and something called existence harmonics that seemed to involve the fundamental ways Zilithians perceived reality itself. Veth Kir explained. "We experience it as movements in an ocean. Kethvar was forced to become an island, isolated from the ocean that gives meaning to existence." As the days passed, Elena watched Kethvar slowly begin to heal. The physical rehabilitation was relatively straightforward. The creature's enhanced regenerative abilities, a side effect of the biological modifications, meant that muscle tone and neural function recovered quickly with proper therapy. But the psychological healing was more complex. Elena's role in the process was initially unclear to her. She wasn't a therapist or a telepathic specialist, but gradually she realized that her presence served as an anchor for Kethvar, a safe point of reference that existed outside the complex web of Zilithian consciousness. You represent survival, Sir Athmore explained during one of their regular consultations. When Cathvar connects with the Mind Songs now, they know that you are here, separate but supportive. It allows them to engage with our collective consciousness while maintaining the individual strength they developed during their isolation. Elena began to understand that Cathvar had emerged from their ordeal changed in fundamental ways. The torture had been designed to break them, to reduce them to a shell of telepathic ability. Instead, it had created something new, a Zilithian who retained their species' natural telepathic gifts while possessing an unusual degree of individual psychological strength. The breakthrough came during Elena's third week at the facility. She was sitting with Cathvar in one of the therapy chambers reading reports from the ongoing investigation into the illegal research program when the creature began to sing. But this wasn't the painful isolation song Elena had heard before, or the gentle healing harmonies that had characterized the early therapy sessions. This was something entirely new. The song began as a simple melody but quickly grew in complexity, incorporating harmonic elements that Elena recognized from her weeks of observation. Other patients throughout the facility began responding to the music, their own voices joining in a spontaneous chorus that filled the entire mountain with resonant harmony. Elena felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of connection that went beyond words or even emotions. For just a moment, she could feel the edges of what it meant to exist within the Zilithian collective consciousness. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Extraordinary, Vethkir breathed, monitoring the session from the observation chamber. Cathvar is not just reconnecting with the Mind Songs, they are creating new ones. Patterns we have never heard before. Sir Athmore arrived within minutes, bringing with them a collection of senior therapists and researchers. What they witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about Zilithian psychology. Cathvar was singing songs that incorporated elements of individual consciousness in ways that traditional Mind Songs did not. The melodies carried the collective emotional resonance that defines Zilithian telepathy, but they also maintained distinct individual perspectives that allowed for unprecedented complexity and depth. This should not be possible, one of the senior researchers muttered, studying the harmonic analysis. Individual consciousness and collective resonance are supposed to be mutually exclusive states. Elena found herself at the center of another scientific breakthrough, though this one felt very different from the horrific discoveries that had brought her to Cathvar Prime. Instead of documenting torture, she was witnessing evolution. Over the following weeks, Cathvar's new form of Mind Song began to influence other patients at the facility. Zilithians who had been struggling to reconnect with collective consciousness found that Cathvar's hybrid approach offered them a path back to their people while preserving the individual strength they had developed during their trauma. You have created something unprecedented, Sir Athmore told Elena during one of their evening discussions. Not just by saving Cathvar, but by being present during their healing. Your human concepts of individual resilience have somehow merged with our collective consciousness to create new possibilities for both our species. Elena wasn't sure how she felt about that. She had acted on compassion, not scientific curiosity. The idea that her presence had somehow influenced Zilithian evolution felt too large and significant for her to fully grasp. But she couldn't deny what she was witnessing. Other facilities began requesting consultations about Cathvar's hybrid approach to consciousness. Zilithian philosophers and psychologists arrived to study the implications of songs that maintained both individual and collective awareness simultaneously. More importantly, other victims of telepathic trauma began responding to treatment approaches based on Cathvar's experiences. Elena found herself serving as an informal advisor to therapy programs across Zilithian space, her unique perspective on individual consciousness proving invaluable in treating patients who had been isolated from the Mind Songs. The work was rewarding but emotionally exhausting. Elena heard stories of torture, experimentation, and psychological warfare that made her original encounter with Cathvar seem like a simple rescue mission. The galaxy, she was learning, contained forms of cruelty that she had never imagined. But it also contained forms of healing that gave her hope for the future. Elena's official duties as a patrol commander had been suspended indefinitely, with Central Command reassigning her to special diplomatic liaison status that gave her broad authority to continue her work with the rehabilitation program. She suspected this was partly politics. Her story had become something of a cause célèbre in human space, and the government wanted to associate itself with her success. But she also suspected it was partly genuine recognition that she had stumbled into something important. The hybrid consciousness techniques that Cathvar had developed were proving applicable to other species as well. Preliminary research suggested that the approach might help treat various forms of psychological trauma across the galactic community. Elena was becoming, against all expectations, a pioneer in the field of cross-species therapeutic intervention. The irony was not lost on her. She had started as a patrol officer looking for simple problems with clear solutions. Now she was helping to develop new forms of consciousness that might reshape how different species understood each other. "Do you regret it?" Kethvar asked her one evening as they sat together in the facility's central garden. The creature's mind songs had become so sophisticated that they could communicate complex, abstract concepts with ease. Elena considered the question seriously. Her old life had been simpler, more predictable. She had known her place in the universe, and her responsibilities were clear. Now she was navigating uncharted territory with consequences she couldn't fully understand. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it, even though it has changed everything for you." Elena smiled, listening to the evening songs that drifted through the facility as patients and staff prepared for sleep. The harmonies were more complex now than when she had first arrived, incorporating the hybrid patterns that Kethvar had pioneered. "Especially because it changed everything," she said. That night, Elena dreamed of songs that bridged the gap between isolation and connection, between individual strength and collective belonging. When she woke, she realized that Kethvar's healing was nearly complete, and that her own transformation was just beginning. 2 years after Elena first heard that distress beacon on Kepler, 442c, she stood before the Galactic Council's newly established Committee on Consciousness Rights, delivering her final report on what had become known as the Kithara Protocols. The chamber was packed with representatives from 47 different species, each seeking to understand how one human's compassionate response to suffering had transformed the galaxy's approach to psychological warfare and telepathic crime. Elena had never wanted to be a symbol, but symbols, she had learned, chose their own bearers. "The protocols we have developed are not just about treating victims of telepathic trauma," she told the assembled delegates. "They represent a fundamental shift in how we understand consciousness itself across species boundaries." Behind her, a holographic display showed the current status of rehabilitation programs across the galaxy. 83 facilities now employed techniques derived from Kethvar's hybrid consciousness approach. Success rates for treating telepathic isolation trauma had improved by over 200%. More significantly, the protocols had been adapted for use with non-telepathic species, creating new therapeutic approaches for various forms of psychological torture. But the most important development was represented by Kethvar themselves, who now served as the lead coordinator for victim advocacy across all the rehabilitation programs. Elena turned to address a question from the Andorian representative about the ethical implications of consciousness modification. It was a complex issue that had emerged as the protocols gained wider application. If consciousness could be healing through careful intervention, what safeguards existed to prevent abuse of the same techniques? "The key principle," Elena explained, "is that all consciousness modification must be consensual and oriented toward restoring the individual's natural psychological state. The Kithara protocols specifically prohibit any intervention designed to alter a being's fundamental nature or impose external values." The question period continued for over an hour, covering everything from funding mechanisms to training requirements for cross-species therapists. Elena answered each inquiry with the expertise that came from 2 years of intensive study and practice in a field that hadn't existed when she first found Kethvar dying on that barren moon. When the formal session ended, Elena made her way to the private chamber where Kethvar waited. The creature had grown even larger over the past 2 years, their body finally reaching the full size that the genetic modifications had been designed to support. More importantly, their mind songs had evolved into something that other Zilithians described as unprecedented in their species' history. "How did it go?" Kethvar asked, their communication now so sophisticated that Elena no longer needed translation equipment. The telepathic link they had developed allowed for direct conceptual sharing, though Elena's human consciousness could only access the most surface levels of Zilithian telepathy. "They approved funding for 15 more facilities and established the independent oversight board we requested," Elena reported. "The Androians want to pilot a program for treating war trauma, and the Centauran delegation offered to host a research conference next year." Kethvar's response came as a complex harmony that conveyed satisfaction, gratitude, and something that might have been amusement. "Do you remember when you thought your biggest challenge was explaining my presence to your superiors?" Elena laughed, remembering her fear during that long flight to Haven Station. The diplomatic crisis she had worried about had indeed materialized, but not in any way she could have anticipated. Instead of being court-martialed for kidnapping an alien, she had found herself at the center of a galactic movement to reform how conscious beings treated each other's minds. "Speaking of challenges," Elena said, "have you made a decision about the research proposal?" The proposal in question came from a consortium of universities seeking to study the long-term effects of consciousness hybridization. Kethvar's unique mental architecture had proven stable and beneficial, but questions remained about whether similar modifications could be safely induced in other individuals. I will participate, Kethvar decided after a moment of harmonic consideration, but only if the research includes safeguards to prevent the techniques from being weaponized. We have seen enough of what happens when consciousness becomes a tool of war. Elena nodded, understanding the concern. The illegal research program that had created Kethvar had been completely dismantled, its perpetrators prosecuted under new laws specifically written to address telepathic crimes. But the underlying techniques could theoretically be adapted for offensive rather than therapeutic purposes. There's something else, Elena said, pulling up a classified communication on her personal display. Central Command wants to know if I'm ready to return to active patrol duty. It was a question Elena had been expecting for months. Her special diplomatic status had always been intended as temporary, and now that the Cathara protocols were well established, there was pressure for her to resume her original career path. Kethvar's mind song took on subtle undertones of concern. Do you want to return to patrol duty? Elena considered the question carefully. Patrol duty represented the life she had known before. Simple problems with clear solutions, regulations to follow, predictable challenges. There was appeal in returning to that clarity after 2 years of navigating uncharted ethical and scientific territory. But she also thought about the messages she received daily from beings across the galaxy who credited the Cathara protocols with saving their lives or the lives of loved ones. She thought about the research projects that were expanding understanding of consciousness across species boundaries. She thought about the young Zilithian therapists who were learning to bridge individual and collective awareness in ways that strengthened both. I think my patrol duties have evolved, Elena said finally. There are different kinds of emergencies now, ones that require different responses than I was trained for. Kethvar's harmony shifted to something that conveyed deep satisfaction. The galaxy needs patrol officers who understand that some rescues require breaking rules rather than following them. Elena smiled at the memory of her first decision to violate protocol by treating Kethvar's injuries rather than waiting for proper authorities. That choice had seemed momentous at the time, but now she understood it as the first step in a much larger journey. There's one more thing, Elena said, opening another communication. The Zilithian Council has formally invited me to establish a permanent embassy on Cathara Prime. I would serve as humanity's first ambassador for consciousness rights. The position would formalize her work with the rehabilitation programs while giving her diplomatic status that could help protect the interests of trauma victims across species boundaries. It was an honor that Elena hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. You helped create something new in the universe, Kethvar observed. It makes sense that you would help guide its development. Elena looked out through the chamber's viewport at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, beings were suffering forms of psychological torture that she couldn't even imagine. But also somewhere out there, other beings were learning new ways to heal, to connect across species boundaries, to bridge the gap between individual consciousness and collective belonging. What do you think? She asked Kethvar. Are you ready to be stuck with me for the foreseeable future? Kethvar's response came as a complex musical composition that took several minutes to complete. When Elena's consciousness finally processed all the harmonic layers, she understood that she was hearing something unprecedented, a mind song that incorporated human concepts of friendship and loyalty with Zilithian ideals of collective purpose and individual strength. It was a song that could only exist because a human had refused to abandon a dying alien on a barren moon, and because that alien had refused to let isolation destroy their capacity for hope. I think, Kethvar said when the song ended, that our work is just beginning. Elena activated her communication system and began composing messages, one to Central Command accepting the ambassador position, another to the University Consortium agreeing to participate in the consciousness research, and a third to the Galactic Council requesting expanded funding for trauma rehabilitation programs. As she worked, Kethvar began singing again, this time a simple harmony that other patients throughout the facility picked up and expanded. The song grew in complexity as it spread, incorporating voices from across Cathara Prime and eventually reaching other facilities on other worlds. Helena paused in her typing to listen. The mind songs had become something she could partially understand now, after 2 years of exposure to Zilithian consciousness techniques. This particular composition was about hope, she realized. Hope that suffering could be healed, that isolation could be bridged, that different forms of consciousness could learn to support each other rather than destroy each other. It was a song that told the story of what happened when someone refused to walk away from suffering, even when all logic suggested that walking away was the smart choice. Elena smiled and returned to her work, writing letters that would shape policy across the galaxy, while harmonies that had never existed before filled the air around her. She was no longer the patrol officer who had answered a distress beacon 2 years ago, just as Kethvar was no longer the dying creature she had found on that moon. They had become something new together, a partnership that bridged species boundaries and proved that compassion could be its own form of intelligence, one that recognized suffering and refused to accept it as inevitable. The galaxy was a vast place, full of different forms of consciousness, different ways of understanding existence, and unfortunately, different ways of inflicting suffering. But it was also full of possibilities for connection, healing, and growth that had barely begun to be explored. Elena looked at Kethvar, whose massive form dominated one side of the chamber, and felt the familiar warmth of satisfaction that came from doing work that mattered. They had started with one rescue on one moon, but they had ended up creating something that might outlive both of their species. "Ready for the next challenge?" she asked. Kethvar's harmonic laughter filled the chamber, a sound that somehow managed to be both individual and collective at once. "With you, always." Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in patterns that had remained unchanged for billions of years. But the consciousness that observed those stars had evolved, grown more complex, learned new ways of connecting across the vast distances between minds and worlds. Elena returned to her letters, writing the Future One policy proposal at a time, while around her the songs continued, melodies of hope and healing that would eventually reach every corner of the galaxy, carrying with them the simple message that no one should have to suffer alone. It was a good legacy for a distress beacon that had gone unanswered for 3 months until one stubborn human decided that regulations were less important than compassion. The galaxy was learning to sing in harmony, and Elena Vasquez had helped teach it the words.